Tonight, we journey into the shadows, unraveling stories of terrifying encounters with entities from realms beyond. If you think you're brave enough, join us as we delve into accounts that defy logic and chill the soul. But beware! Each tale serves as a haunting reminder that some doors should remain closed. Title: The Darkness Within. The Ramirez household was a quiet one, but not in the way that usually brings peace. It was the sort of silence that carried tension like a coiled spring, ready to snap at the faintest sound. Young Richard, a boy of 12, knew this well. He moved through the house like a ghost, eyes down, footsteps light. His father was often home, exhausted from long hours at work, but Richard sensed the simmering anger in him, like a barely contained fire. On nights when the anger boiled over, Richard's father would lash out, not always with fists, but with words that cut and stung just as deeply. Richard learned early that it was best to be invisible, to fade into the background. But he felt that fire within himself, too, a smoldering anger that he couldn't quite understand. He'd watch his mother's resigned face as she scrubbed dishes long past clean, as if scrubbing away the bitterness that clung to their lives. "Richard," his father barked, snapping him out of his thoughts. "Get out of here. Can't you see I need some peace?" Richard nodded quickly, retreating without a word. Outside, the night was dark and quiet, but it held a kind of freedom that he'd never felt inside the house. Under the open sky, he could breathe, and a strange, restless energy would fill him. A desire to escape, to act out, to do something that would make him feel powerful. Richard's cousin, Miguel, arrived one summer when Richard was 13. Miguel was older, charismatic, and mysterious. He was a war veteran, and something about him was different from anyone Richard had met. Miguel was both captivating and unsettling, his stories full of violence and cruelty, told with a detached pride that Richard found both terrifying and fascinating. Miguel didn't treat him like a child, and for that Richard was grateful. Instead, he took Richard under his wing, sharing stories from his time in the war, stories of brutal fights and of soldiers who did things Richard could barely imagine. Miguel laughed as he described these things, his voice full of a dark thrill. "The world isn't what you think, Richard," Miguel would say. "You've got to be strong, tougher than anyone else. You can't rely on anyone but yourself." One night, as they sat in the garage under dim light, Miguel pulled out a stack of photographs, grim images from his time in Vietnam. Richard's stomach twisted as he looked, but he couldn't turn away. He felt something shift inside him, a grim curiosity that wouldn't be denied. One night, a fight broke out between Miguel and his wife in the kitchen. Richard watched from the shadows, hidden but present, as Miguel's anger boiled over. A gunshot cracked through the air, startling Richard to his core. Miguel's wife lay motionless, and Richard felt a sickening mix of horror and awe as he looked at his cousin standing over her. "Remember this, Richard," Miguel said, his voice low and unshaken. "You have to be in control. Weakness is dangerous." For the first time, Richard understood the depth of Miguel's philosophy. He felt a numbness creeping in, as if a line had been crossed. He wasn't shocked by the violence. Rather, he was intrigued by the way Miguel wielded it as if it were a weapon he had complete control over. Richard's need to feel control soon took on a life of its own. He began sneaking out at night, slipping through quiet neighborhoods, breaking into houses. His first attempt was clumsy. He fumbled with a lock and almost got caught. But there was a thrill to it, a rush of adrenaline that made him feel powerful, alive. Over time, he became more careful, more calculating, choosing his targets with care and ensuring he left no trace. It wasn't about the items he took, trinkets he would later discard. It was about the feeling it gave him, a sense of power that he couldn't find anywhere else. Each break-in was an assertion of control, a way of testing the limits of his growing darkness. One night, as he crept through a stranger's house, he paused in front of a family photo. His reflection in the glass stared back at him, a twisted smile creeping onto his face as he felt a strange sense of belonging to the shadows. Richard's break-ins evolved from theft to something darker. He watched his next target, an elderly woman, noting her routine with chilling precision. The night he chose to act, he felt no remorse, no hesitation. His hands moved with a cold certainty, and when it was done, he felt a strange sense of satisfaction. "This is who I am," Richard thought as he looked down at his victim. There was no fear, only a feeling of completion. The crime shook the neighborhood, but Richard remained calm, almost indifferent. He was already planning his next move. Driven by a compulsion he couldn't fully understand but felt powerless to resist. Richard begins to feel an unstoppable urge to push further, compelled by the thrill of controlling the lives of others. He becomes bolder in his choices and targets, seeking out those he believes will be the most challenging or terrifying for him to confront. His sense of power grows, yet with it, his recklessness begins to seep through. Richard lay in bed, his eyes wide open in the dark. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding, as if it were a countdown to his next thrill. He thought of his last encounter, the rush, the fear in their eyes, the pulse of life he'd felt slipping away in his grasp. He couldn't resist it anymore. He had to go out again. In the silence of the early hours, he slipped out of his house, moving like a shadow through the deserted streets. Every sound, every flicker of movement, heightened his senses. This was his world, a place where only he held the power to decide who would wake up and who wouldn't. As Richard's crimes escalate, so do his internal struggles. He becomes haunted by visions and nightmares, seeing images of his victims flash before him. His mind becomes a chaotic battlefield where he wrestles with fear, thrill, and a strange guilt that only drives him further into his violent impulses. One night, he woke up drenched in sweat, his chest heaving as if he'd been running. In the darkness, he could see them. Faces, pale and expressionless, staring back at him from the corners of his room. They didn't accuse him, didn't scream. They just watched him, as if waiting for him to do something. He shook his head, trying to push them away, but they stayed with him, haunting him through every quiet moment. Richard felt as if he were losing his grip, teetering on the edge of something dark and endless. Yet, instead of scaring him, it pulled him deeper into his twisted desires. One night, during a particularly bold break-in, Richard miscalculates. The family he targets has an alarm system he hadn't noticed, and before he realizes it, he is surrounded by the piercing sound of sirens. Barely escaping, he feels the cold thrill of almost getting caught, a sensation that is both terrifying and exhilarating. The moment he heard the alarm, his body went rigid, his blood turning to ice. He'd been so careful, so meticulous. How could he have missed this? He ran through the house, his footsteps echoing against the walls, heart racing as he searched for an exit. The sound of sirens drew closer, and he knew that this was a moment that could end everything. Slipping out a back window, he darted into the shadows, blending into the night as the police lights painted the neighborhood in flashing blue and red. He felt a rush unlike anything he'd felt before, a mix of terror and excitement. This close call left him feeling invincible yet aware of the ever-narrowing line he walked. Feeling untouchable after narrowly avoiding capture, Richard begins incorporating dark rituals into his routine, as if they could help him stay in control of his surroundings. He begins leaving strange markings at crime scenes, something he believes will ward off anyone who might come close to finding him. This pattern of ritualistic behavior adds an eerie and unsettling dimension to his actions, hinting at the further unraveling of his sanity. At each scene, Richard now took an extra moment to etch symbols into the walls or furniture, simple shapes that he believed held power. These symbols became his signature, a way to mark his territory and, in his mind, protect him from capture. He was no longer just taking lives. He was creating a legacy, something dark that would last long after he was gone. The police began to notice these symbols, puzzled and unsettled by their presence. They knew they were dealing with someone more than just a violent intruder, someone with a deeply disturbing mind. The fear in the city grew, and Richard could feel it. He fed off it, drawing strength from the terror he instilled. Richard's recklessness and growing ego create rifts in his life. He becomes more paranoid, feeling as though every glance, every quiet whisper, is someone who suspects him. The lines between reality and his fantasies start to blur, leading him to make dangerous mistakes that bring the authorities ever closer to his trail. As he walked through the neighborhood, Richard felt eyes on him, following his every step. He'd catch glimpses of people glancing his way, whispers shared just out of earshot. Paranoia tightened its grip around him, and he found himself looking over his shoulder at every turn. Even in his own home, he felt exposed, as though his own walls were conspiring against him. He became suspicious of neighbors, of family members, even of strangers who passed him on the street. But he couldn't stop himself. He was trapped in the pull of his own creation, caught between the thrill of the hunt and the growing threat of being hunted. Determined to prove his control and defy the mounting pressure, Richard plans his most daring crime yet. This time, he chooses a high-profile target, someone who will send shockwaves through the community. He approaches with a meticulous plan, but the act itself begins to spiral out of control, ending in a chaotic, almost frenzied attack. He watched his target's house from a distance, studying every detail, the lights that turned on and off, the times they left and returned. He knew everything about them, down to the faint glow of the porch light and the dog that barked at the slightest sound. The night of the attack, he moved with precision, every step rehearsed in his mind. But as he approached the final moment, something snapped. His movements became erratic, driven less by planning and more by impulse. When it was over, he was left standing in the silence, his hands shaking, the weight of what he'd done sinking into him. Richard's paranoia grows as he becomes convinced that those around him might be on to him. Small details, someone's lingering glance, a car that seems to follow him, begin to shake his nerves. He tries to keep up appearances, but even his closest acquaintances start noticing his frayed demeanor. Richard's hands trembled as he adjusted his tie in the mirror. He'd never been one to doubt himself, but lately, he felt like he was being watched. He forced a smile, practicing the expression he wore every day, yet it felt foreign on his face. At work, his coworkers exchanged uneasy glances when he wasn't looking. His responses were sharper, his patience thinner. Even his voice, once calm and composed, carried an edge that unsettled those around him. But Richard paid little attention. His mind was consumed by other, darker thoughts. The police become more active in their investigation, connecting some of the evidence left at Richard's crime scenes. Richard becomes aware of this, and it shakes him to the core. He has to alter his routine, leaving him feeling exposed. Despite his attempts to stay calm, he realizes he's being followed by detectives and becomes increasingly reckless in covering his tracks. As he turned the corner one evening, Richard's stomach clenched at the sight of a police cruiser parked across the street from his usual path. He forced himself to keep walking, his steps controlled, his gaze straight ahead, even as his pulse pounded in his ears. Days later, he spotted one of the detectives again, the same man who'd been at his last scene. It was then he realized that this officer wasn't just doing his job, he was watching him. One night, Richard attempts another crime, but it goes wrong. The victim fights back, managing to escape and notify the police, who arrive quickly. Richard narrowly avoids capture, hiding out in a secluded spot until he's certain the coast is clear. This failed attempt leaves him feeling both exposed and furious. Richard's heart raced as he crouched behind a thick wall of shrubs, listening to the sounds of distant voices and police radios. He could feel his pulse in his throat, a panicked rhythm that seemed to mock his otherwise calculated demeanor. He clenched his fists, his mind racing. This had been a mistake, a miscalculation, and now there was someone out there who'd seen him, someone who could identify him. Rage twisted inside him, mingling with the raw fear he couldn't shake. Now feeling the weight of his near capture, Richard becomes erratic. He starts making impulsive decisions, his meticulous planning beginning to fall apart. This recklessness makes him more vulnerable, and his actions leave more clues for investigators. He becomes increasingly isolated, avoiding friends and family who notice his strange behavior, and his world begins to shrink around him. He moved through his days like a ghost, hollow and haunted. The world around him faded, leaving only the shadows he'd created. Every noise, every passing car, every conversation seemed aimed at him, an invisible web tightening around him. He had no idea who was safe to trust or where he could hide. At night, the darkness felt heavy, pressing down on him as he tossed and turned, unable to escape the shadows he'd created. He was trapped, both in his mind and in the world he'd tried to control. Asterisk. The detective who had been following him grows more suspicious and begins piecing together the signs Richard left behind. They launch a more intensive investigation, slowly building a profile that leads them closer to identifying him. Richard feels the pressure mounting, and it begins to consume him. Detective Harris leaned over the table, studying the evidence spread before him. There were patterns, subtle but consistent, threads that linked each crime. And there was the suspect, a ghost-like figure seen by witnesses, slipping through shadows. Harris knew he was close. He could feel it. Every detail seemed to point toward one man, but he couldn't make the connection final. Not yet, but he could feel it. He was circling closer, narrowing in. And soon, there would be no place left for Richard to hide. Asterisk. The tension drives Richard to his breaking point. Desperate to escape the encroaching threat, he contemplates leaving town, abandoning his life entirely. But his obsession won't let him leave until he feels he's regained control. In a desperate attempt to prove his mastery over his situation, he plans one final elaborate act, believing it will put an end to his paranoia. Richard paced his apartment, his mind racing. He couldn't leave, not like this. He needed one last moment, one last act that would erase the fear gnawing at him. Something to prove he was in control, that he was the one who held power. That night, he set out with a renewed determination, a plan that had formed in his mind as a twisted answer to his growing anxiety. This would be his masterpiece, the final mark that would free him from the nightmare he'd created.